BPD isn't the only mental illness I've struggled with before. This story was inspired by my nightmarish childhood OCD. Like the borderline, my OCD now isn't much more than a background noise that I'm able to ignore most of the time. Though some of Richard's symptoms and experiences were inspired by my own or those of people I know, this story is entirely fictional. Richard seemed to be an ordinary child at first. There were no complications during his mother's pregnancy or during birth. He met all his milestones within the expected time frames, sometimes much earlier than other children his age. There were no allergies or serious medical conditions. On the surface, Richard appeared to be just like any other kid. When Richard was 7, his parents started to notice some unusual habits. Richard would obsessively repeat certain words and phrases to himself, usually at specific times of day. He was constantly washing his hands, so often that the skin was cracked and red raw. He sprayed his shoes with a thick layer of disinfectant 3 times daily and avoided touching any surfaces in public places. If Richard did happen to touch something, he would immediately sanitize his painfully overcleaned hands. This made Richard's eyes water, but he had to do it. When other children sat too close to Richard, he would experience an intense feeling of panic and sometimes experience breathing difficulties. Richard would compulsively check that all the taps in the house had been securely tightened, that the stove hadn't been left on, and that all the doors were locked. He would check multiple times despite having just checked it a few minutes prior. Sometimes Richard would be awake well into the night repeating these rituals, washing his hands, and crying because he was so mentally and physically exhausted. This behavior was difficult to watch, but Richard's parents didn't know how to help. It wasn't until Richard attempted to drink cleaning products that they took him to a doctor. Their GP prescribed a medication commonly used to treat OCD and referred the family to a child psychologist. The psychologist supported Richard to work on strategies that would help manage his symptoms. Richard found these strategies to be somewhat helpful, but the medication he was on had caused him to gain a significant amount of weight. This affected Richard's confidence and self-esteem, not that he had much to begin with. Sometimes the kids at school teased Richard about his weight or his unusual behavior, and he would often try to avoid going to school and cried during the car ride there. As Richard got older, his mental health continued to deteriorate. As soon as he was legally an adult, Richard stopped taking his medication and going to therapy. He didn't want to take pills that made him fat or talk to someone he felt didn't understand. Richard's symptoms progressed, and he developed extreme food aversions. If the food wasn't perfectly symmetrical, Richard couldn't eat it. If there were specific combinations of letters or numbers on the label or the color green, he couldn't eat it. Even if an intrusive thought happened to cross Richard's mind while he was touching the food, he couldn't eat it. Richard was also obsessively paranoid about food tampering, and would often convince himself that his food had been poisoned, even if there was no evidence to suggest that might have happened. He lost so much weight that his parents were worried he might die of starvation. Richard's fear of germs also got much worse, to the point where he wouldn't even leave his room, which had its own bathroom, and wouldn't allow anyone else to go in there. Richard started shaving all the hair that grew on his body to be completely hairless, either due to intrusive thoughts or because he thought it was more hygienic. The situation got so out of control that Richard was hospitalized after repeatedly giving himself enemas with an unknown cleaning solution, at first due to medical reasons, but he was later moved to the psychiatric ward. While in the psych ward, Richard would often become so distressed that he would have to be sedated. After a few months, he started to make progress with his treatment and was released under certain terms and conditions. Richard had agreed to a set of rules around managing his symptoms and behaviour to prevent any further injury or illness that might be caused from acting out his compulsions. Richard was also required to continue taking the medication he was prescribed while in the ward and keep regular appointments with a psychologist. Richard's life really started to improve, and he had learnt that the more he ignored his compulsions, the easier it became not to act on it, like using a muscle. Richard wasn't as distressed by his obsessions or intrusive thoughts, and had even developed a social life and gained employment at an antique store. For the first time since he could remember, Richard was feeling okay. In his early 30s, Richard moved in with his girlfriend Cassie. They had been dating for over a year, and this had been his first serious relationship. Although his treatment had been going well, Richard still struggled with physical contact, which made it difficult to maintain relationships. It was different with Cassie though. She made him so happy that he forgot all about the germs. Around 6 months after moving in together, things started to go downhill. Richard became paranoid that something bad was going to happen to Cassie and obsessively monitored her health and safety. He would often cry at night because he was so worried about her, even though there was nothing to be worried about. He started to perform strange rituals again, to prevent something bad from happening to Cassie, of course. Richard knew that these rituals made no difference to what may or may not happen, but the fear of losing the person he loved most in the world was so intense he couldn't ignore it. This made Cassie uncomfortable, but she knew about Richard's OCD and tried to be empathetic. She attended a few counselling sessions with Richard's psychologist for information and suggestions on how she could help. Eventually, Cassie couldn't handle it anymore and left. Richard continued to live alone in the apartment they had shared. His parents came to check on him throughout the week and gifted him a pet hamster for company, because hamsters are very hygienic animals. The hamster did cheer Richard up a little. One of his friends suggested he move out of the apartment so that he wouldn't be constantly reminded of Cassie. Richard did move to a new apartment with his pet hamster, and eventually he started to feel better again. One day his boss asked him to attend an antique show so that he could look for some new items to sell in their shop. This is where Richard met Louise, his next serious girlfriend. Richard really liked Louise, but it wasn't like with Cassie, where his fear of physical contact melted away. Richard was open and honest with Louise about his mental illness, and she was very understanding. Louise didn't mind that Richard would use sanitizer after holding hands with her, or the way he went all stiff and rigid when she hugged him. Louise thought that eventually he would get used to it. Richard did become more comfortable with Louise and having physical contact over time. The first time they had sex though, Richard immediately washed all the bedding and insisted that they both have a shower. Louise thought that this too would eventually subside, but it never did. She broke things off with Richard just under 12 months into their relationship. Richard felt relieved when it ended, and he no longer had to worry about his perceived impurity of the relationship. And sometimes Louise forgot to take her shoes off before entering his apartment, which really stressed him out. Richard did like Louise, but he found maintaining the relationship exhausting. They were able to stay friends afterwards and continued to see each other at work-related events. Richard had accepted that he was never going to live a normal life, but he was content with the way things were. The OCD no longer consumed his entire existence, though it did make some things more stressful and complicated than it needed to be. Richard decided to give up on the idea of having romantic relationships. All he needed were a few good friends and his pet hamster. For Richard, this was as good as it gets. One morning when Richard was at work, a man brought in a dark green vintage sofa with velvet cushions. Richard felt a sharp stab of panic when he looked at the sofa, though he didn't know why, possibly because it was his least favourite colour. The man explained that his wife had acquired the sofa at an estate sale, but he hated it and didn't want it in the house, so he had decided to get rid of it while she was at work. He didn't want any money for the sofa, he just wanted it out of his house. Richard thanked the man for his generous donation and asked one of his co-workers to help move it to the back storage area to be processed. Richard's hands were trembling as they moved the sofa through the store. As soon as they put it down, Richard was flooded with horrifying, traumatic memories that included a sofa just like this one. He felt sick and contaminated. Intense feelings of shame and embarrassment washed over Richard, and he slowly lowered himself to the floor before losing consciousness. His co-worker called an ambulance and Richard was taken to hospital. At the hospital, Richard wouldn't stop crying and kept trying to cover himself in sanitizer until one of the nurses took it away and sedated him. After being medically examined, Richard was sent over to the psychiatric ward for the second time. The doctors tried to talk to Richard, but he wouldn't communicate with anyone and seemed to be stuck in a regressed childlike state. Richard was kept sedated and he started talking again the following day. He spoke in a slow, monotone voice, either from the sedatives or dissociation. Richard's parents came to see him, and he asked if they'd known about what had happened to him as a child. When Richard disclosed his trauma, they didn't react the way you would expect concerned parents to respond to such a confronting revelation. This led Richard to believe that they had known about it, or at least suspected. His parents admitted that they had noticed Richard's odd behavior started after he'd stayed with a certain relative, but they had never questioned him about it, perhaps because they were afraid of what they might have discovered. Richard wondered why they had allowed this person to continue having contact with their child after noticing his sudden change in behavior. Why hadn't they protected him? The doctors had told Richard that his condition was most likely caused by a combination of genetic and biological factors, but Richard felt that this terrible thing he'd spontaneously remembered after seeing a vintage green couch was the reason. His parents hadn't protected him, and the person who had harmed him got to continue living their best life without any consequences, while Richard would have to suffer a debilitating mental illness for the rest of his, especially now that he'd remembered. His mind felt unclean, and he had the urge to take his brain out and submerge it in bleach. He would never again feel like he wasn't broken and contaminated. Richard stopped acting on his compulsions. It no longer provided temporary relief for his distress. To an outsider looking in, this must have seemed like an improvement, because Richard was discharged from the hospital. He had told his parents that he no longer wanted any contact with them the day they had come to see him. They had been caring for his pet hamster while he was in hospital, but he never went to get her back, and his parents thought that they should give him space, so they never checked on him after he was discharged. Richard's boss grew concerned after not hearing from Richard for a while about coming back to work. He knew that Richard loved his job and had kept in contact with him during his time at the hospital. After unsuccessfully trying to get in touch with Richard a number of times, his boss called the police for a welfare check. Richard was found dead in his apartment. He had ended his life by drinking a combination of bleach and drain cleaner. On the kitchen table was a note that said, "I give up."